The rain fell quietly over the excavation site, a soft patter that seemed almost respectful of the centuries of silence beneath the soil. I stood there, trowel in hand, staring at the earth as though it might speak to me directly. Archaeology is usually a slow, deliberate craft, punctuated by quiet awe and sudden realization. But today the air seemed heavier, as if the ground itself held its breath. Around me, my colleagues worked in subdued conversation, their voices distant, careful, each footstep a whisper across the soaked dirt. We had been here for weeks, uncovering what we thought would be the remnants of a forgotten village, a place where life had once thrived in quiet simplicity. And yet, as we peeled back the layers, the story beneath became something entirely different, something dark, something that carried a weight far beyond mere soil and stone. The first bone appeared in the damp earth, small and delicate, yet unmistakably human. I crouched slowly, letting my gloved fingers trace the edges of what seemed to be a child's wrist. The way the bones lay, the careful placement in the shallow pit, suggested intention, ritual even. It was not violence in the chaotic sense, not the aftermath of battle. This was deliberate, and it was centuries old. I took a breath, steadying myself, and called the others over. They approached silently, the rain muted by the canopy of our temporary tents. There were no words at first, just glances, the subtle tightening of jaws, the slow understanding that we had stumbled upon something profoundly tragic. As the excavation continued, more bones emerged, each one telling a fragment of a story I could almost hear, a soft echo of lives extinguished long ago. There were infants, their tiny hands curled as if reaching for someone who would never come. There were older children, their small frames fragile and broken, lying as though they had been placed in the earth with care and sorrow. It was a tableau of loss, a silent testament to a human cruelty that refused to fade, preserved in the soil like ink on ancient parchment. I couldn't help but imagine them, the faces I would never see, the voices I would never hear. And yet, through the work of our hands, through careful brushing and cataloguing, they began to speak. There is a strange intimacy in archaeology, particularly in moments like this. When you uncover something that has lain hidden for centuries, you are granted a kind of closeness to the past that is both breathtaking and unsettling. I found myself thinking of the child whose wrist I held, imagining the last moments of their life. Was it fear that gripped them, or confusion, or the quiet resignation of one who has known only obedience? Who placed them here? Was it a parent, a priest, a neighbor? And why? These questions are unanswerable, yet the earth offers its own response, not in words, but in the careful arrangement of remains, the patterns that speak of ritual, of ceremony, of acts both sacred and horrifying. We worked slowly, meticulously, uncovering more than just bones. Artifacts surrounded the pit's small figurines, fragments of pottery, charred remnants of offerings. Each object whispered of lives lived in complex ways, lives that were abruptly ended yet carefully honored. It was a paradox that weighed heavily on me, reverence and cruelty entwined so tightly that one could not exist without the other. I remembered reading about Tophets in Carthage, where children were sacrificed to appease gods, their tiny bodies placed among urns and ceremonial objects. And yet, here, in this remote corner, far from the Mediterranean, far from historical record, a similar story unfolded silently beneath our tools. As the hours passed, I became aware of a tremor in my chest, a quiet grief that seemed to rise unbidden. Archaeologists are trained to maintain objectivity, to catalogue and describe, to place findings within historical context. Yet objectivity can only stretch so far when confronted with the immediacy of human suffering. Each skeleton demanded recognition, each arrangement of bone cried out for understanding. I thought of my own children, sleeping safely miles away, unaware of the horrors unearthed by my hands, and I shivered. These were not monsters we uncovered, not the caricatures of myth, but humans fragile, mortal, and utterly defenseless in the hands of a society whose beliefs had dictated their fate. Night fell slowly over the site, the rain continuing its gentle percussion on the tents, and we lit lanterns to continue our work. Shadows danced across the pit, elongating bones, turning small fragments into grotesque silhouettes. And yet, despite the eerie spectacle, there was beauty in what we found. The care with which the bodies had been placed, the offerings left alongside them, spoke of a world that recognized the sanctity of life even as it extinguished it. I knelt beside a particularly small skeleton, perhaps no more than 5 years old, and traced the curve of its tiny ribcage. It was impossible not to imagine a name, a life, a story of laughter abruptly silenced. As I worked, my mind wandered to the larger implications of what we had uncovered. This was not an isolated incident, Not a single act of cruelty, but a glimpse into a civilization whose rituals we could scarcely comprehend. How many others lay beneath the earth, waiting for hands like ours to unearth them? How many voices, silent for centuries, still sought recognition? The pit grew, the bones multiplying as we dug deeper, each layer revealing more than the last, a hierarchy of tragedy carefully preserved by time itself. The sky above darkened further, the rain steady now, a relentless witness to the work of our hands and the lives of those long gone. There is a peculiar kind of conversation that occurs at excavation sites in moments like these. A dialogue not of words but of gestures, glances, and shared understanding. My colleagues and I moved with synchronized care, the world outside the tent forgotten, the present fading into the whispering past. The silence was punctuated by the soft scrape of trowels against soil, the occasional clink of pottery fragments, the subtle sighs of those who dared to imagine the lives that had once been. No one spoke unnecessarily. To speak too loudly would have seemed like an intrusion, a disturbance of the delicate equilibrium that time had maintained for centuries. Hours turned into days, and yet the excavation revealed layer after layer of haunting detail. Patterns emerged in the placement of the bodies, in the orientation of the skeletons, in the objects left beside them. Each detail told a story, and each story was a testament to a society whose understanding of life and death was intertwined with fear, devotion, and ritual. We catalogued, measured, and photographed, but beyond the technical work lay an emotional truth that could not be quantified. These were lives, and in their careful arrangement beneath the earth, a message persisted. They were not forgotten, and they demanded remembrance. I found myself reflecting on the nature of memory, both personal and collective. Archaeology is, at its core, an act of remembrance. We unearth not just artifacts, but fragments of human experience. In this pit, the experiences were raw and unflinching. A confrontation with the capacity for both devotion and cruelty that has defined humanity across millennia. The child whose wrist I had held at the beginning of the excavation was no longer merely a skeleton in the dirt. In my mind, they became a symbol of all those who had suffered quietly, whose stories were erased by time, yet preserved beneath layers of soil, waiting patiently for discovery. Night deepened, and I remained by the pit, alone for a moment, lantern flickering, shadows swaying. Listening to the rain, I felt a presence not of the living but of those who had been. It was a weight, a stillness, a quiet insistence that history cannot remain buried forever. And perhaps, in that insistence, there was a lesson for us all, that cruelty, devotion, fear, and love are timeless, and that even when the world seems indifferent, the earth remembers. I brushed soil from a small fragment of bone, letting it rest gently on my palm, and whispered an acknowledgement, a promise of memory, a recognition of life once lived. The rain began to ease, and the site fell into a delicate quiet. My colleagues returned, and together we continued our work with steady hands and subdued voices. The pit was no longer merely a hole in the ground. It had become a repository of stories, of lives that demanded attention. Each brushstroke, each careful uncovering, was a conversation across centuries, a dialogue between the living and the dead, a bridge between the present and the past that refuses to be forgotten. And so, we worked through the night, the rain now a gentle mist, the lanterns casting soft light on fragile bones, each one a testament to the endurance of memory, the persistence of history, and the haunting beauty of human life, even in its most tragic forms. I knew that as long as we continued to uncover, catalogue, and reflect, these children, these individuals, these lives would speak. They would tell their stories to anyone willing to listen, and in doing so, they would ensure that the silence imposed upon them for centuries was finally broken. Please like, share, and subscribe my channel. The sun had barely risen over the horizon when we arrived at the next site, a city long swallowed by time, its streets empty and silent, yet heavy with memory. The ruins stretched before us like the bones of some long-forgotten giant, their skeletal outlines jagged against the amber morning light. Dust rose from the cracked stone streets with every step, and the wind carried the faintest echo of laughter, cries, and footsteps that had not walked here for centuries. I paused at the edge of the main square, letting the stillness settle around me, allowing the ghosts of this place to whisper in the quiet. Archaeology often offers such moments, where the past feels almost tangible, and one can almost hear the echo of lives once lived. Today, however, that echo seemed louder, more insistent, and tinged with something I could not yet name. We began to walk through the ruins, careful not to disturb the fragile remains of walls and doorways, each fragment a story frozen in stone. It was clear that life had thrived here once, a bustling city with families, merchants, and children running through narrow alleys, their voices mingling with the clang of tools and the laughter of the marketplace. And yet, the evidence of sudden disruption was equally undeniable. Many homes were left as they had been abandoned, dishes still on tables, bedding unmade, and toys scattered in the corners. One could almost imagine the final day, the moment when those who lived here realized that nothing would ever be the same again, when panic overtook daily routines and ordinary life ended abruptly. As we carefully explored one particularly intact household, we discovered the skeletal remains of a family clustered in what had once been their living room. Their positions suggested they had tried to shield each other, a final act of protection in a moment of unspeakable terror. A mother, her arm stretched protectively over her youngest child, her jaw slightly open as if frozen in a cry, lay beside a man whose hands clutched the remnants of what had once been a simple meal, and the children, small and fragile, were intertwined in a desperate embrace. The tragedy of it was overwhelming, a tableau of fear and love intertwined, preserved in the quiet of stone and dust. I found myself kneeling beside them, tracing the contours of their bones, imagining their final moments, and feeling the weight of centuries settle heavily on my chest. Outside, the streets held more secrets. In a narrow alley, partially covered by collapsed walls, we uncovered dozens of skeletons, each one telling a story of desperation and sudden death. Their postures suggested they had tried to flee, only to be overtaken by an invisible force: disease, starvation, violence, or perhaps all three. The air seemed thick with the memory of their final moments, the silence almost unbearable. It was a city where life had ended swiftly and collectively, leaving behind not chaos, but a quiet, haunting order that made the tragedy even more poignant. One could almost see them running, hear the cries, feel the hopelessness as they realized escape was impossible. We documented every detail, carefully photographing and cataloging each find. But the technical work did little to ease the emotional weight of what we uncovered. The city, abandoned for centuries, was a monument not only to human ingenuity and daily life, but also to the fragility of existence. These people had loved, fought, played, and hoped, only to have their lives cut short, their stories interrupted, and their voices silenced by the passage of time. And yet, in their silence, they spoke more clearly than words ever could. Every cracked wall, every abandoned toy, every skeleton frozen in its final gesture was a reminder that life is ephemeral, and that the past, no matter how distant, continues to reach out to the present. One of the more haunting discoveries was a small courtyard where the remains of what appeared to be a communal meal had been left untouched. Bowls of clay, now shattered and eroded by centuries of weather, were scattered across the floor. The skeletal hands of those who had sat there were still positioned as though reaching for food, frozen in a moment of routine and sudden cessation. The juxtaposition of ordinary life and abrupt death was overwhelming. It spoke to a universal truth, that tragedy does not announce itself, that ordinary days can end with unimaginable finality, and that the ordinary acts of living, the preparing of meals, the care of children, the laughter of companions can all vanish in an instant, leaving behind only echoes and remnants. As the day wore on, we moved through the city, uncovering more homes, more skeletons, and more artifacts that testified to the lives that had once animated this place. In a small workshop, we found the remains of a craftsman, his tools still at his side, as if he had been interrupted mid-task in a nearby alley. The skeletons of two children were discovered, their small hands clasped together, suggesting a final act of comfort in the face of incomprehensible fear. Every find, every detail, added layers to the story, revealing the depth of human emotion, the intensity of fear, and the resilience of love even in moments of despair. Night fell, casting the ruins in deep shadow, and the city seemed to exhale, releasing the memory of the lives that had once thrived here. The wind whispered through collapsed walls and empty streets, carrying with it the faintest suggestion of laughter and cries, a chorus of voices from the past that no longer had mouths to speak. I lit a small lantern and continued to move through the streets, imagining the city as it had been, alive with movement, color, and sound. The contrast between past vibrancy and present emptiness was almost unbearable, a silent testament to the power of time to erase and preserve simultaneously. I reflected on the families whose lives had ended so abruptly, imagining the terror that must have filled their hearts, the final thoughts that passed through their minds. Did they cling to hope until the very last moment, or did they succumb quickly to despair? Did they hold each other close, whispering reassurances that could no longer be heard? These questions were unanswerable, yet they demanded contemplation. For in imagining these final moments, we honor the humanity of those who came before us. Archaeology, in this way, becomes an act of empathy, a bridge between centuries, a recognition of lives that are otherwise forgotten. As the lanterns flickered, casting long shadows across the broken streets, I became aware of the weight of silence. Silence is different from emptiness. It carries memory, expectation, and reflection. The city, though devoid of life, was not empty. It was saturated with the imprints of the past, with acts of courage, desperation, and love frozen in time. And as I knelt beside another cluster of skeletons, I felt an overwhelming sense of connection, not only to those who had lived and died here, but to the continuum of human experience that stretches across the centuries, linking all of us through the shared vulnerabilities of existence. The night deepened, and we gathered around a small fire, speaking in hushed tones about the day's discoveries, careful not to disturb the echoes of history that lingered among the ruins. Each revelation carried with it a weight, a reminder of the fragility of life and the enduring power of memory. We could only catalogue, measure, and record. But beyond these actions lay a deeper truth, that the past is alive in the present, and that the lessons it offers are as much emotional as they are factual. In the final hours of darkness, I walked alone through the streets once more, imagining the city as it had been on its last day of life. I saw families rushing, craftsmen working, children playing, merchants calling their wares, all of them unaware that the end was imminent. And then I imagined the moment when everything changed, the invisible hand of fate striking, the sudden realization of doom, the final acts of courage, protection, or despair. It was a haunting vision, one that I could not shake, one that would remain with me long after the excavation ended, a reminder of the profound weight of history, and of the fragile beauty of human existence. By dawn, the city had yielded its secrets for the day, and I stood at the edge of the ruins, gazing across streets and walls that had once thrummed with life. I felt a quiet reverence, a sadness, and a sense of responsibility. To uncover the past is to bear witness to it, and in bearing witness, we honor those who lived, suffered, and loved long before we walked these earthbound streets. The sun rose slowly, casting a golden light across the broken stones, illuminating the traces of life that had once filled this city. And I knew that in telling their stories, we ensure that they are never truly gone. Please like, share, and subscribe my channel. The air in the tomb was thick, damp, and silent, carrying the faint scent of earth and decay. Lanterns cast trembling light against the walls, illuminating carvings that had been etched centuries ago, a language of devotion and fear, of life and death, that had long ceased to be understood by the living. I stepped carefully, my footsteps muffled by the soil-strewn floor, aware that each movement was a disturbance in a space that had remained untouched for generations. Archaeology, I had learned, is as much about restraint as it is about discovery. The past requires reverence, a soft touch, and the patience to allow it to reveal itself. And tonight, the tomb seemed determined to speak in whispers, offering fragments of stories both horrifying and deeply human. The first skeleton I noticed lay in a narrow alcove, curled tightly as if trying to make itself small, to become invisible in the shadows. The positioning suggested that the individual had not simply died of old age or illness, but had been placed there deliberately, confined in a space meant to contain, to imprison, or perhaps to protect. As I knelt beside it, my gloved fingers brushing away centuries of dust, I realized the subtle evidence of struggle, the tiny scratches on the surrounding walls, the fractured ribs, the slight distortion of the jaw. This person had not accepted death passively. There had been a final, desperate fight for life, a last attempt to escape the confines imposed upon them by forces long gone. I could not see their face, yet I felt their fear as acutely as if it had been my own. Moving deeper into the tomb, I uncovered more, skeletons arranged with careful precision, bound hands resting over chests, some with small objects tucked between fingers. It was clear that these were not random burials. They were ritualistic, ceremonial acts performed with intention, belief, and sometimes cruelty. The stories that unfolded from these remains were horrifying in their simplicity and devastating in their humanity. Young servants interred alongside rulers, presumably to accompany them in death, lay side by side with the remnants of those chosen for punishment, those sacrificed, and perhaps even those who had resisted. Each discovery revealed a society with a complex understanding of loyalty, obedience, and mortality, and yet, one willing to extinguish life in the name of tradition, power, or faith. In one narrow chamber, I discovered a particularly haunting arrangement. A small figure, barely more than a teenager, buried upright, their spines slightly curved, hands pressed against the chest in a gesture that suggested both submission and fear. Soil had pressed in from above, the weight of centuries pressing down upon their fragile frame. Their fingernails were chipped and broken, and the jaw was slightly open, a silent scream frozen in time. It was impossible not to imagine the final moments, how the light had dimmed, how the air had grown heavy, how hope had drained slowly from those eyes that would never see another sunrise. I felt an ache in my chest, a visceral response to the enormity of their suffering, and I whispered a quiet acknowledgement of their life, however brief it had been. As we continued our meticulous work, the patterns became clearer. These were not acts of indiscriminate violence, but carefully orchestrated ceremonies, each with rules, rituals, and roles that dictated the fates of those interred. Some were guardians, chosen to protect the tomb in death, their loyalty cemented through the ultimate sacrifice. Others were victims of social or political transgressions, selected for punishment even as they had served faithfully in life. And yet, in the midst of this horror, there was a profound sense of humanity. Each body, each artifact, each fragment of bone revealed the same longing and the same fears that define us today. The desire to be remembered, the hope for protection, the pain of separation, and the terror of oblivion. The lanterns flickered as we moved from chamber to chamber, casting long shadows that danced across the walls, turning simple carvings into grotesque, living forms. And in these shadows, I began to see the stories more vividly. I could imagine the servants who had been chosen, their footsteps echoing in silent halls, the hushed prayers whispered as they were led to their fate, the fleeting glances exchanged with loved ones who could offer no protection. I could imagine the priests, the rulers, the enforcers, performing their duties with solemnity and detachment, convinced of the righteousness of their actions. And I could imagine the weight of belief, of fear, of societal expectation pressing down on all involved, shaping lives and deaths alike. There was one particularly narrow passage where the floor had given way, revealing a hidden chamber beneath. I knelt at the opening, peering into the darkness, and felt a cold shiver run down my spine. Inside, more skeletons lay, each with hands bound, some pressed against walls, others with tiny tokens or charms clasped in fingers. It was a chamber of entombment, a place where life had been extinguished slowly, deliberately, in accordance with a ritual now impossible to fully comprehend. The atmosphere was oppressive, heavy with the presence of countless souls who had once inhabited these bodies, their fear and resignation lingering in the air like a fine mist. I felt both awe and grief, recognizing that archaeology is as much about the human heart as it is about history. I spent hours examining the remains, careful not to disturb the delicate arrangement of bones. There was one figure, slightly taller than the others, whose skull had been tilted back unnaturally, jaw slack, as if gasping for air that never came. Soil had partially filled the mouth, yet the position suggested a final struggle, a desperate attempt to resist the inevitable. I imagined the sound of a cry, muffled by stone and earth, and felt an ache that transcended time, reaching across centuries to touch my own pulse. These individuals had been human, with hopes, fears, and desires that mirrored my own, and yet their lives had been extinguished in ways both terrifying and ritualized. Artifacts surrounded the remains, some simple, others ornate. Small figurines, carved amulets, and ceremonial objects hinted at beliefs and practices that intertwined life and death, devotion and violence. Each object was a key to understanding the society that had created it, yet no key could fully unlock the human experience behind it. The lives behind these artifacts had been cut short, their stories only partially recoverable through the evidence left behind. I carefully catalogued each piece, photographing and measuring, yet my mind lingered on the human dimension, the faces, the final thoughts, the emotions frozen in the silent tomb. Hours passed as the tomb revealed more secrets, each discovery a new layer of horror and empathy intertwined. The arrangement of skeletons, the patterns of entombment, and the artifacts all spoke of a civilization with strict hierarchies, complex belief systems, and an acceptance of mortality that was both pragmatic and terrifying. The young, the loyal, the rebellious all had met the same fate in these chambers, their lives and deaths meticulously recorded by time itself, awaiting the hands that would unearth them centuries later. Night deepened, and I found a quiet corner to rest for a moment, lantern flickering, shadows dancing across the walls. I reflected on what we had uncovered, not merely the bones of the dead, but the echoes of their final moments, the resonance of their fears, and the traces of their humanity. There was a strange intimacy in these encounters, a connection across centuries that transcended the boundaries of life and death. I realized that archaeology is not simply about understanding the past. It is about feeling it, recognizing the continuity of human experience, and acknowledging the enduring presence of those who came before. As I rose to continue, I felt a profound sense of responsibility. Each skeleton, each artifact, each fragment of bone was a testament to lives lived and lost, to rituals that were terrifying yet deeply human, and to the persistence of memory across the centuries. I knew that in telling their stories, in carefully documenting their existence, we honored their lives, their struggles, and their final moments. The tomb, once silent, had spoken, revealing the complex interplay of devotion, fear, cruelty, and love that defines the human experience. I worked through the remainder of the night, the tomb yielding its secrets, slowly, methodically. Each discovery was a reminder that history is not distant, that the past is alive beneath our feet, and that the lives of those long gone continue to resonate with the living. And as the first light of dawn touched the edges of the chamber, illuminating dust motes in the air like tiny stars, I felt both exhaustion and reverence. The tomb had revealed its story, fragment by fragment, and I understood, in the quiet of that morning, that the act of uncovering is also the act of remembrance. Please like, share, and subscribe my channel. The night was quiet, the kind of quiet that presses gently against your ears and settles into the bones, reminding you that time moves differently in places that have long been abandoned. I sat beside the last trench we had opened, the small lantern flickering softly, casting shadows across the uneven soil. The work of the previous months weighed heavily upon me, each discovery a thread of humanity stretched across centuries, fragile yet persistent. This site, unlike the others, seemed to pulse with memory. The bones we uncovered, the artifacts we catalogued, the patterns of ritual and survival lore spoke to a world that had existed long before our understanding, yet demanded to be remembered. As I traced the edge of the trench with my gloved hand, I imagined the people who had lived here, families, children, elders, workers, leaders. They had walked these lands, laughed, cried, and dreamed, unaware that their lives would be frozen into silence for generations. The past is often distant and abstract, but here it pressed against me with clarity. Each fragment of bone, each broken piece of pottery, each mark on the walls was a voice reaching out, insisting that we see, that we remember, that we understand. I breathed slowly, letting the weight of this realization settle, the rhythm of inhalation and exhalation mingling with the soft hum of the night around me. Our work continued through the early hours, uncovering a series of interconnected chambers that had served as living spaces, ceremonial halls, and final resting places. Each room revealed a new chapter of life and death, each arrangement of bodies and objects telling stories of devotion, fear, loyalty, and desperation. I knelt beside a small cluster of skeletons, a mother and child still intertwined in death, their positioning suggesting an act of protection, a final embrace that defied the passage of time. The soil beneath them bore the subtle imprint of hurried construction, as though someone had tried to seal them away quickly, to hide or honor them, or perhaps both. It was impossible to know. What remained, however, was clear. Their humanity endured, even in the quiet of death. I moved through the site slowly, deliberately, allowing my senses to absorb the atmosphere. The artifacts we had uncovered, a delicate figurine, a simple clay bowl, a ceremonial amulet, spoke of lives once lived with care and intention. Each object was a testament to the duality of human nature, the capacity for creativity and love, and the willingness to impose suffering in the name of belief or power. I held the figurine carefully, feeling the smooth curves of its form beneath my fingers, and imagined the hands that had crafted it, the thoughts and intentions behind its creation, the hands that had perhaps offered it in a final ritual. It was a bridge between then and now, a tangible connection to lives that would otherwise have been silent. The tombs we explored revealed patterns that were both methodical and deeply human. Individuals had been interred according to rank, devotion, or perceived loyalty, their positions within the chambers carefully considered. Some had been buried with objects of comfort, tokens of faith, or reminders of their roles in life. Others had been placed in ways that spoke of punishment, obedience, or fear. And yet, through every act of ritual, every decision made by the living for the dead, there persisted a quiet insistence on recognition, on remembrance. Death had not silenced them completely. The earth preserved their stories, and we were privileged to witness them. As dawn began to touch the edges of the excavation, painting the soil in soft hues of gold and amber, I paused to reflect on the journey we had undertaken. From the first pit of bones to the ruined cities, to the tombs of ritual and punishment, each site had revealed a fragment of a larger story, a story of humanity in all its complexity, in all its beauty and horror. The lives we uncovered were a mirror, reflecting our own capacities for love, devotion, cruelty, and survival. And as I sat there, the wind rustling softly through the remnants of walls and collapsed structures, I realized that our work was not merely about discovery, it was about bearing witness, honoring memory, and allowing the past to speak to the present. In the final chambers, I found individuals whose stories were impossible to ignore. A young servant, hands folded in a gesture of submission, lay beside the remnants of a ritual offering. A child, perhaps no older than 7, still clutched a small toy or token, a gesture of innocence preserved through death. And nearby, an elder whose bones were worn with age and hardship, positioned with reverence among the others, spoke silently of dignity and endurance. Each encounter was a reminder that history is not just a series of dates and events, but a tapestry of human experiences, woven from the lives, struggles, and emotions of those who came before us. I moved to the edge of the site, looking back at the labyrinth of trenches, chambers, and uncovered stories. The past had yielded its secrets gradually, deliberately, offering fragments of insight that demanded attention, reflection, and care. I thought of the countless individuals whose lives had ended in fear, devotion, or obligation, and I felt the weight of their stories pressing gently against my consciousness. To remember them, to speak of them, to document their existence, is to acknowledge the continuum of life and death, the threads that connect us to generations long gone. The wind carried faint echoes of the past, or perhaps it was my imagination, merging the memory of discovery with the quiet of the night. I closed my eyes, allowing the sensations to settle, both the beauty and the horror, the intimacy of human experience, and the stark reality of mortality. In the silence, I understood something essential. The dead are never truly silent. Their lives, actions, and even their suffering leave imprints that persist across centuries, carried in soil, stone, and memory. And those who uncover these imprints, those who bear witness, become part of the story, responsible for carrying it forward, allowing the voices of the past to resonate in the present. As the sun fully rose, casting a gentle light over the site, I packed away my tools slowly, reverently, careful not to disturb any further the fragile remnants of human existence. Each skeleton, each artifact, each mark in the soil had demanded attention, empathy, and patience. And in honoring them, we acknowledged a deeper truth, that life, love, fear, devotion, and cruelty are timeless, and that even in death, there is a presence that reaches across time to remind us of our shared humanity. I stepped away from the site, taking a last look at the earth that held so many stories, so many lives, so many lessons. The weight of history pressed gently against my shoulders, a reminder of the responsibility inherent in discovery. The dead had spoken, in whispers and shadows, in fragments of bone and carved objects, in patterns of ritual and burial that transcended centuries. And as I turned toward the quiet horizon, I carried their stories with me, a promise to remember, to honor, and to share. The past, though silent in life, speaks profoundly in death, and in listening, we find connection, understanding, and a profound respect for the fragility and resilience of humanity. Please like, share, and subscribe my channel.